I looked in YouTube, evidence for the resurrection. I think that's all that I searched. And like the first couple videos that popped up was a lecture by William Lane Craig on just the historical evidence for Christianity. And when I watched this episode and I watched this, it literally changed my life. I was like, I had no idea that there was evidence like this for Jesus, for the resurrection.
And I received the gospel uncritically.
And from that point forward, I started to investigate further and further, and I came across eventually the work of Dr. Michael Licona. You know, there's a claim that goes around that, the first accounts that we have of Jesus are, decades and, even up to 100 years after Jesus was dead and crucified. And that is just completely false. Like we learn in our Bibles, in what we have, 1 Corinthians 15, there's a creed, there's an early creed that the church had up to, and some scholars date this back to within 3 months of Jesus' crucifixion.
If all we had was an early creed, which we do for other religions sometimes. I've been reading a little bit on mystery cults. Again, I completely agree that I would not believe it actually happened.
This is the kind of evidence that really kind of blew me away, because again, I wasn't expecting to find really good evidence, really good arguments for the truth of Christianity. I was expecting, and maybe this is just a fact of, I don't know what this is. I don't know what to attribute this to. Maybe it's just a fact of culture, the culture that I grew up in, is that I was expecting not to find any evidence. I was expecting to just think that you have to believe in Christianity on faith.
To my experience, many Christians will admit that faith is a belief that is not based on evidence.
That's what I was expecting to find. And what I found was the opposite. And so one other thing, in addition to like finding early creeds and stuff in the Bible, and there's a whole lot more evidence that we'll get into later, I also started to look at some of the rival hypotheses that atheists and skeptics have given in response to the resurrection.
My alternative is called the Old Testament hypothesis, which says that early Christians believed the Old Testament to be a historically reliable source of information about Jesus, and then they mistook their religious experiences for confirmations of this belief.
So you lay out these different facts, and you do an abductive argument for the resurrection based on certain facts about Jesus, historical facts about Jesus. So the burial, the crucifixion. Crucifixion comes first, I guess, and then burial.
So let's start with the narratives of the empty tomb found in the Gospels. So Isaiah 53 verse 9 says, "They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich." And according to my hypothesis, the Gospel authors just mistakenly believe that here Isaiah is talking about Jesus. So when they wrote the Gospels, they wrote a story about Jesus's burial in a rich man's grave, which is consistent with the source, being Isaiah. And then they added details on top of the source based on their existing beliefs. So for example, early Christians were Second Temple Jews, so they believed specifically in a physical resurrection of the body. So if you have a body that's buried in a rich man's grave and it undergoes a physical resurrection, well, that tomb becomes empty.
And then the appearances of Jesus, which people had experiences of Jesus being raised from the dead. And then also you talk about the origin of the belief of the disciples, and how weird it was for someone to come up with this belief.
Early Christians believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and they believed that the Old Testament describes what the Messiah will do. So they naturally believed that this is what Jesus did, even though he didn't actually do some of those things, right?
Anyway, so the best explanation is that God raised Jesus from the dead, but naturalists have not been silent about this. They've given their own accounts, their own views, their own hypotheses of what could explain all this data about Jesus. And when I started to look into those more carefully, like the swoon hypothesis, the conspiracy hypothesis, the hallucination hypothesis, as I looked into these, I found that they were really bad.
And we know that authors of Greek historical biographies frequently invented details on top of what their sources said to create what they thought is a plausible narrative of what actually happened. And this was a standard literary practice at the time. It wasn't considered deceptive. And the audience actually understood that this is normal. So it's important to realize that they were not lying or they were not trying to scam people with a fictional story, right? The problem is that they mistakenly believed that the Old Testament talks about Jesus. So they treated it as a historically reliable source.
They, like very few, almost nobody believes in conspiracy theory. Nobody believes in the swoon theory. And Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, there's only a handful of people that believe in the hallucination hypothesis.
Oh, no, that's probably the most popular naturalistic hypothesis today.
So we don't have to appeal to, for example, hallucinations or things that only exist in the mind of an individual and cannot be shared by a group of people. And out of many, many possible explanations like that, I'm just picking one as an explanation, and that's pareidolia, which is a human tendency of incorrectly perceiving stimulus as a meaningful pattern.
When I started to look into these and I started to assess them for myself, like I said, the conspiracy theory, swoon theory, hallucination hypothesis, I found that these theories were just bad. They didn't do a good job of explaining the data.
And this literary devices theory is very plausible. In fact, there are even many very conservative evangelical scholars who subscribe to it, right? So you don't have to be like a liberal Christian, because it's being endorsed even by people like McLaughlin, Craig Keener, or Craig Evans. So they would say, for example, that the author of the Gospel of John moved the day of the crucifixion to a different day than the Synoptic Gospels for theological reasons, and therefore he invented all kinds of historical details around that. Mike Lacona, for example, thinks that the Gospel of Matthew might have invented the crucifixion signs as apocalyptic imagery, right? So, for example, the resurrection of saints. Or he thinks that the infancy narratives in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke might be largely invented because, and I quote, little was remembered of Jesus's childhood.
And so the evidence, I would say, just to sort of summarize my story real quick, is that the evidence played a very crucial role in explaining or keeping me a Christian, so to speak. So if there weren't good evidence for Christianity, then I think it would have fallen away.
Those are, I'm explaining again as stories created by the gospel authors as a combination of their existing beliefs, namely that Jesus was raised bodily, and what they thought are historically reliable sources. So in this case, they would receive from previous Christians that Jesus appeared to his disciples, so they created a plausible narrative depicting it as they would imagine it. And again, there are even very conservative evangelical scholars like Ona, Keener, or Craig, who think that this kind of narrative flexibility, which was very frequently employed by authors of Greek historical biographies, even applies to the resurrection appearances. For example, they might think that the Gospel of John invented the story of doubting Thomas for theological reasons, and that's why it doesn't show up in any other gospel. Or that the author of the Gospel of John might have invented Jesus breathing the Holy Spirit into his disciples when he appeared to them after the resurrection.
But I can say with a pretty high degree of certainty that if there were no evidence for Christianity, then I probably would have fallen away.